Hello, my name is Steve Joanis. I'm a longtime parishioner of St. Brendan Parish in Bellingham, Massachusetts, and this is a short history of the parish. When I was given the opportunity to talk about the history of our church, I immediately started thinking about the building. When I was a kid going to St. Brendan Parish, I thought that we went to St. Brendan's Church. I thought the church was the building where we went to worship. But that's not what Jesus meant when he told Peter, "You are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church." If you check the dictionary, the church is more than a building. The Merriam-Webster dictionary offers several definitions. One was, a building for public and especially Christian worship. Well, that's a church. Another definition is a body or organization of religious believers, such as the whole body of Christians. Now, that's the church. That organization of believers includes us, and those that have gone before us marked with the sign of faith. That's the church. That's all of us. We are the church. I think the history of Catholics in our area and our parish history is much more interesting when you consider that our forebears exist in eternity and with us are the church. The research I have is the work of many people over many years. I've relied heavily on help from archivists at the Archdiocese, stories from current parishioners like Lita Lorme, and written histories from past parishioners like Florence McCracken. I've uncovered so much information that I could talk for hours, but I've only a short time, so I'll stick to the highlights. St. Brendan Parish exists as a fruit that grew very slowly and in unlikely circumstances. To realize how unlikely it is that a Catholic parish would exist here, I'm going to offer some historical context. One of the Puritan founders of Massachusetts wrote that one of the purposes of the colony was to raise a bulwark against the kingdom of Antichrist, which the Jesuits labor to rear up in all places of the world. In spite of that, the first evidence that I have for a Mass said in Massachusetts was in Boston during 1650. Father Gabriel Drouets, a French Jesuit, was then staying at the home of Edward Gibbons in Boston while he was acting as an envoy for the French governor of Quebec. Historian Francis Parkman wrote in 1867 that the house of the Puritan was, no doubt, desecrated by that popish abomination, by which he meant the Catholic Mass. The next group of Catholics that I find in Massachusetts was 105 years later, when Catholic families were brought here as captives during the French and Indian War. In 1755, French-speaking Catholics, though British subjects, were summarily uprooted from Nova Scotia and forcibly spread throughout the British colonies. Massachusetts likely received over 1,000 of these so-called French neutrals. Several of these Catholic families were living in nearby towns like Medway, Wrentham, and right here in Bellingham. On August 26, 1756, 4 of these French neutrals were assigned to Bellingham, and then on January 27, 1761, James O'Merrill, his wife Mary, and their 3 children arrived in Bellingham from Medway. Sadly, my research informs me that these French Catholics were cut off from the sacraments. To quiet fears that priests had infiltrated Massachusetts, Governor Hutchinson said that he believed that the French neutrals practiced their religion privately, but a priest wouldn't hazard it. After the French neutrals were free to leave, it seems that most did by about 1763. The Catholic hierarchy knew that they had to be careful in America. In 1774, while America was still under British rule, the Sacred Congregation for the Propagation of the Faith decreed that bishops serving in America should not wear the normal attire for their office. This was likely due to the animus that Protestant Americans felt toward the Pope. Hatred of Catholics burned so hot in Massachusetts that the Pope was burned in effigy on the 5th of November each year until 1775. General George Washington himself put a stop to the practice while encamped outside Boston. The next nearby Mass was likely in 1782, when Rochambeau's French army camped in Wrentham on the site that is now King Philip High School. They were on their way back to Boston Harbor after defeating the British at Yorktown. After the American Revolution, the anti-Catholic sentiment here in Massachusetts began to die away. It seems that younger generations of Americans were less fearful of Catholics. That may have been, at least partly, due to America's alliance with Catholic France during the war. The first public Mass celebrated in Boston was November 2, 1788. At that time, there were only about 100 Catholics in Boston. That number started to grow along with the number of Catholics throughout the United States. On November 6, 1789, Bishop John Carroll became the Bishop of Baltimore and the first bishop in the United States. While I was visiting the archives of the Archdiocese in Boston, I found a letter from Bishop Carroll to John Hancock dated 1791, thanking Hancock for his hospitality during a recent visit to Boston. John Carroll was the de facto bishop of the entire United States, since there was only one diocese at that time. In 1807, Bishop Carroll decided that the number of Catholics warranted 5 separate dioceses. Boston was to be one of these first dioceses, and on April 8, 1808, Father Cheverus was nominated the first bishop of the newly erected Episcopal See of Boston by Pope Pius VII. In the year 1810, there were just 3 Catholic churches in all of New England: the Cathedral of the Holy Cross in Boston, St. Patrick's in Newcastle, Maine, and a log chapel for the Indians at Pleasant Point in Maine. However, the number of Catholics began to grow rapidly. By 1829, there were 14,000 Catholics in New England, with 7,040 of that number in Boston. The history of Bellingham states that there were about 12 Catholics in Milford in 1832. The first Mass in Milford was said in a house in 1836, and about a dozen people attended. These people would have had to go to Boston or Woonsocket for baptisms and marriages. By 1835, there were 28,975 Catholics in Massachusetts. By 1845, there were 53,000 Catholics in Massachusetts. The famine in Ireland of 1848 and 1849 brought an increase in Irish immigration to New England. This fact, combined with the construction of roads and a new Framingham to Milford Railway, brought an influx of Irish Catholics to Milford and the surrounding area to fill construction jobs. In 1848, the first Catholic church in Milford was built. By 1850, Catholic people started to cling to the idea that they could carve out a life here in Bellingham. In 1850, there were about 14 persons with apparently Irish names that were likely Catholic. Since there wasn't a church or parish here, they had to go to other towns like Franklin, Medway, or Milford to practice their faith. A few Bellingham Catholics joined the Catholics in Franklin, who bought the old meeting house of Dr. Emmons in 1871 for $3,500 and called it St. Mary's Church. Medway Catholics began at the house of Walter Dwyer in 1850 when Reverend Patrick Cudahy began to come to them. The current site of St. Joseph's Church in Medway was bought in 1863, and St. Clair's Parish was organized in 1864. The first church, St. Clair's, had been a schoolhouse and was later known as the Old Straw Shop. The Milford Church, where most Bellingham Catholics went until about 1870, received Father Patrick Cudahy as pastor in 1857. During this period, the Civil War raged south of here. Many Irish Catholics served in the Union Army. I'm confident that many Irish Catholics from Bellingham and Medway served during the Civil War. Irish-American leaders, including Patrick Donohoe, publisher of The Pilot, one of the most influential Irish Catholic newspapers in the country at the time, offered encouragement and assistance. New recruits were promised pay and rations upon enlistment, state subsidies for their families, bounties of $100 when the campaign was over, and Catholic chaplains to accompany their regiments in the field. I looked over a few muster rolls and found people from Bellingham serving. While the document didn't list their religion, I found Patrick Gallagher from Bellingham, who volunteered with the 4th Regiment of Heavy Artillery on December 27, 1864, and I suspect he may have been Irish. In 1870, Holliston became an independent parish with Medway as a mission. This mission became the church home of the Bellingham Catholics. Reverend Richard J. Quinlan was in charge and built much of St. Joseph's Church in Medway, which was first used on August 12, 1877. The structure wasn't completed and dedicated until November 21, 1886. During a part of this period, Catholics from Bellingham that didn't have their own horse and carriage to get to Mass in Medway could travel on Maurice J. Conley's horse-drawn barge called the Bluebell. I wasn't able to locate a photo of Bluebell in time for the presentation, and there is some debate over whether this barge traveled along roadways or waterways. The fact that it was called a barge and that the Charles River was much broader in 1888 than it is now leads me to believe that Bluebell was a boat. That's when the story starts to get interesting for Bellingham Catholics. In 1888, Father Thomas B. Lowney took over in Medway, which had become its own parish by that time. It was Father Lowney who built St. Brendan Church and established it as a mission of the Medway parish. In fact, he donated some of the stained glass windows in the church. You can see his name on the window behind the altar that depicts the Sacred Heart of Jesus. St. Brendan Parish stands on ground that had been the Pelatiah Smith Tavern. His Catholic employees were not given off time to attend Mass on Sundays or holy days. So, when their chores were finished, they would gather in the apple orchard to pray that someday a church would be built there. My mother, Stella Joanis, told me that her people, meaning Irish Catholics, used to pray on this hill that one day there would be a church here. This building stands as yet another testament to the power of prayer. Around 1893, Michael T. Ryan bought the Smith estate and donated the land for a church. On September 8, 1895, the building was consecrated to divine worship by Archbishop Williams. According to his entry in the Episcopal Register for that day, at 10:75 a.m., blessed the new church in North Bellingham under the patronage of St. Brendan. After Mass, confirmed 24 males and 11 females. Reverend J. S. Cullen of Watertown sang solemn Mass, and Reverend Mike Sheehan preached. The altar boys on that day were John F. and Joseph Murphy, Timothy E. and Charles Foley, William Callahan, and Eugene Conley. There were about 200 parishioners at that time. The first baptism here was that of Joseph Alfred Allard on October 9, 1895. The first marriage was in the following spring, uniting Rosemarie de Rocher and Thomas Bissonette on April 22, 1896. Shortly after the dedication of the new church, Father Lowney moved on to a parish in Marlborough, and the Right Reverend Monsignor Daniel Kelleher became the pastor in Medway, and consequently our little mission here in Bellingham. Father Kelleher had previously been a professor of science at St. John's in Brighton. In this photo from the early 1900s, you can see that the church was set back behind some trees. The exterior of the church has always been white clapboards. The original doors were painted green. Before Pilgrim Village was built, a dairy farm was across the street from the church, and a small stream ran under the road and into the pasture. In back of the church, there was a three-sided carriage shed and a privy or outhouse. Parking was on the street, as we had no parking lot. Parishioners entered the church by the front door. Parishioners back then found it a difficult climb for the older folks, and very difficult for pallbearers during a funeral. If we take a closer look at the church, you can see some of the things that have changed in the last 100 years. In this photo, you will notice that there aren't any shrubs around the church. Those were planted in the 1940s. You will also notice that there are cement steps. Those were replaced with brick steps. Finally, the windows in these photos are not the windows that are currently in the church. The original altar had 3 spires. The one on the end contained recesses that held statues of the Sacred Heart and St. Teresa of Lisieux, the Little Flower. In later years, the end spires were removed because it was thought to be inappropriate to have them higher than the center one, which contained the cross and tabernacle. The side altars resembled the main altar, except the spires were painted on the wall behind the statues of Mary and Joseph. In front of the side altars was a stand containing many votive candles where parishioners would drop a coin and light one and pray for a special intention. Shortly after the church was built, it became the concern of the pastor that there wasn't enough support to hold the roof. Fearing the walls would eventually bulge out, 3 large turnbuckles were installed in the main part of the church. Many years ago, the church had stenciling on the plaster just above the wainscoting. Between the ceiling supports, a scene was painted on each side of the central peak. Florence McCracken wrote that one painting was of a chalice and host, and another a lamb. On each side of the main altar was a rosary in the shape of a chalice. The floor was covered in a charcoal gray linoleum except under the pews where the floor remained uncovered. The wooden kneelers were not hinged or covered. Florence wrote that one of the most appreciated improvements in the church was when the kneelers were padded and hinged. She wrote that one did double penance kneeling on the old hard wooden kneelers. The original lighting was a large chandelier that hung in the center of the church. It was round and contained many lights with glass shades. Father Dwyer served from 1906 until 1910. I wonder if he was related to the Dwyers in Medway that allowed Catholics to gather in their home during the mid-19th century. Father Lee served for 27 years from 1910 until 1937. His service was during World War I and the Great Depression. Father Lee was a prodigious writer, and I felt I got to know him a little bit through the letters he wrote to the Archdiocese. In addition to the things that were happening on the world stage, a few things of interest happened right here in Medway and Bellingham to his flock. In 1924, Miss Edwards, the daughter of Michael T. Ryan that donated the land for St. Brendan's Church, wanted to make a land swap with the church. She wanted to build a home near the church, but she needed land which her father gave to the church for her driveway. The land she wanted is to the left of the church and included the building that is directly to our left now. The area that we received in trade is land behind the church, and the parish hall sits on it now. In 1930, the United States was in the midst of the Great Depression, and this area suffered with the rest of the country. Father Lee asked the Archdiocese for a loan since the people were so poor that he didn't think that they could support the church since the mills were not operating. The response from the bishop was, "Sorry, cannot help. The parish must be self-supporting and the parish priest is responsible." During Father Tatton's time here, he made some improvements. On April 23, 1937, Father Tatton requested permission to spend $100 for a new tabernacle, probably the one that we still have. Also, during his time here, the great New England hurricane of September 1938 blew in the large window of the Sacred Heart over the altar. It was repaired and put back into place. When I was a kid, I always wondered why some of the panes looked irregular. On May 26, 1937, Father Tatton got a quote to remove the cement steps and install new brick steps for the entryway for $400. In these two photos, you can see the old cement steps on the left and our current brick steps on the right. In this photo from Stella Joanis' wedding in 1941, you can see the old stone wall in front of the church and Miss Edwards' home mentioned in the 1924 land swap. For much of World War II, Timothy Gleason was the pastor. I didn't find much from his time here. In the 50 years between the construction of the church in 1895 and the Jubilee 50 years later in 1945, 7 pastors of St. Joseph's in Medway served here. Reverend Ralph Farrell was the last. A lot happened during those years, both nationally and here in Bellingham. Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945, and Japan surrendered on August 15, 1945, effectively ending World War II. Sadly, some of our parishioners died during that war. Our monstrance was donated in 1945 in memory of John Reardon, who was killed in action during the war. In October of 1945, Michael F. Ryan, the son of the same Michael T. Ryan who donated the land for St. Brendan's, gave more land to the church. 1945 was a big year here at St. Brendan's. On September 19, 1945, St. Brendan's celebrated its 50th anniversary, and the Most Reverend Louis Francis Kelleher presided at the Golden Jubilee Mass. Many former pastors and curates attended. Father Kelleher also dedicated the Marian Shrine that was constructed by the men of the parish in honor of the occasion. Shortly after that, Father Farrell received a letter dated November 15, 1945, informing him that St. Brendan's would be a separate parish. On Sunday, November 18, 1945, it was announced at Mass. Our new pastor was to be Father John J. McCarthy. Father McCarthy said his first Mass here on Wednesday, November 21, 1945. After meeting with the parishioners, Father McCarthy settled on 2 Sunday Masses, one at 8:30 and the other at 10:30. Father McCarthy rented a 3-room apartment in the home of William Buckley. Florence McCracken remembered him as an independent man who asked for no help from anyone. He did his own cooking, snow shoveling, and lawn mowing. In the mid-1940s, the 3 light fixtures hanging in the church were installed. These large cylindrical fixtures were surrounded by 4 satellite lamps that operated independently of the main fixture. These were later removed, leaving just the 3 cylindrical fixtures. About the same time the chandelier was replaced, fluorescent lights were added on the altar, discreetly hidden. Chimes were hung on the altar wall and buttons installed on the altar steps to be used during the consecration of the Mass. The chimes were later removed and replaced by the bells once more. The first 3 or 4 pews were reserved for Sunday school children, the girls on the left, the boys on the right. A nun would sit behind them. In January of 1947, Father Driscoll wrote that he had an office in the area he called the storeroom of the church. Florence McCracken mentioned that he had an office set up in the vestry, and it wasn't unusual to hear the phone ring during Mass. It was during Father Driscoll's leadership that most of our current stained glass windows were installed. In one of Father Driscoll's letters, he told Archbishop Cushing that he would need the support of a housekeeper when he gets a rectory. It didn't take long for Father Driscoll to get a rectory. In May of 1947, Father Driscoll wrote for a loan for $14,000 to buy the house next to the church from Martin Glockner. The home was originally built in the mid-1920s by Thomas Heffernan. That house had also been the home of longtime parishioner Stanley Fabian when he was a child. According to Lee DeLorme, Stanley's wife Fran Fabian was a housekeeper there for many years. Over the next 11 years, the St. Brendan Parish had 3 pastors: Father Cornelius Mason, Father John Broderick, and Father John Kearns. I didn't find much information beyond their names, photos, and dates of service. On March 25, 1964, Father Griffin was given permission to purchase 36 acres abutting church property. The hope was that the new housing development directly across the street from the church would bring many new Catholics to the area. There was even talk of taking down this church to make a driveway for a much larger church further back. On April 30th, 1964, Father Griffin bought the land from Dana and Ramona Wilkins for $21,500. The deed was recorded on May 5th, 1964. Not much happened to our church in the period from 1965 to 1968. In 1966, New England Power Service Company got an easement for transmission lines. The big changes that took place between 1965 and 1972 were related to the Second Vatican Council. Under Father Moriarty, the altar was moved forward to allow the priest to walk behind it, and the communion rail was removed along with the statues in the sanctuary. In this photo, you can see the communion rail. Before Vatican II in the 1960s, congregants received communion on the tongue only while kneeling at the altar rail. Another pre-Vatican II photo reveals that the altar is set back such that the priest cannot walk behind it. Before 1965, Masses were said ad orientem, with the priest facing the same direction as the congregation, and the prayers were spoken in Latin. Before that time, Sunday Masses were only on Sundays. The first Sunday Vigil Mass on a Saturday night at St. Brendan's was July 5, 1969. It was on January 17, 1970, that the Peace Be With You handshake was introduced here at St. Brendan's. During the 1960s, when Saturday afternoon and evening Masses were allowed, we had Masses at 4 p.m. and 7 p.m. Saturdays, and Sunday at 7 a.m., 8:30 a.m., 10 a.m., and 11:30 a.m. At that time, our pastor was also assisted with the Masses by a priest from the Xaverian Fathers in Holliston. When I was a kid, we still had the 10 and 11:30 a.m. Masses. Father Eichhorn from Stonehill College used to help out Father Gilmartin. Father Gilmartin was here for a long time, and I remember him and his pipe well. When I was young, I served as an altar boy. There were 2 annual events that stand out to me from my time as an altar boy: Father Gilmartin's annual box of chocolates that he gave to altar boys, and the washing of the feet. On Holy Thursday, altar boys should have clean feet and good socks, since Father Gilmartin would select 12 of us to have our feet washed by him at the front of the church during Mass. While Father Gilmartin was pastor, Mary Walsh was the longtime caretaker of the rectory. When the large stained glass window of the Sacred Heart was restored in 1993, her name was added to the bottom right and can be seen there today. During Father Gilmartin's 23 years with the parish, he got a lot done. He was here in 1972 when the parking lot was paved for the first time. He had a new organ installed, and he had new outside doors installed. We may never know the eternal fruits of his long service, but his largest temporal accomplishment for our parish was the construction of the parish hall. The official groundbreaking for construction of the hall was in February of 1993. According to Lee DeLorme, the initial cost was estimated at over $750,000. That number came down to less than $650,000 due to the labor provided by parishioners. As an example, John Ayer built the entire stone patio area outside the hall and dedicated the work to his father, who had been a longtime parishioner. You can see similar stonework where John lived on Pine Street. There is also a plaque commemorating his father that can be seen from the patio. Some of the money was raised by people who went door to door by twos seeking donations, but a large part of the cost was in the form of a loan. The hall was dedicated a year later on October 17, 1993. On Sunday, September 24, 1995, Father Gilmartin and Cardinal Law celebrated the centennial Mass of the church building and retired from service as pastor here at St. Brendan's shortly afterward. I've often heard Father Mullen tell the story of seeing St. Brendan's Parish while passing through Bellingham and wishing that one day he would be in a parish like it. Our beloved Father Mullen arrived here in 1995 and has been with us ever since. Father Mullen inherited the loan left from the construction of the hall, but through his disciplined and careful use of our resources, he had it completely paid off within 10 years. With Father Mullen as pastor, a lot has happened. At his invitation, the Franciscan Sisters Minor joined our parish in 2003 and moved into 391 Hartford Ave, the house diagonally across the street from the church next to the Old North School. I know that house well because that was my foster home growing up. It seems to me that the Eucharist follows the Rosary. People prayed the Rosary on this hill, and now there is a tabernacle here. This photo is of a little shrine that my mom had on the porch at 391 Hartford Avenue where people would gather to say the Rosary. Now, there is a tabernacle there. It is a wonder to me that Jesus is present in the house that I grew up in. In 2010, the Franciscan Sisters Minor left to enter a cloister in Fort Wayne, Indiana. It wasn't long after the Franciscan Sisters Minor left before the Franciscan Handmaids of the Immaculate joined us. I'm happy to say that they are still with us, making our community of prayer and worship that much more powerful. While sifting through hundreds of documents, artifacts, and photographs, a few people kept coming up over and over again. No historical talk about St. Brendan's would be complete without mentioning the contributions of parishioners like Gladys Griffin, Rita Badsmarowski, Lee DeLorme, Marianne Donahue, and Deacon Hackett. According to Gladys Griffin, Rita Badsmarowski helped out at the church for all the time she was here. Her son John remembered her helping while Father Moriarty was here. Rita was also part of the women's club that started the fall fair. As long as she was able, she was a sacristan. When she was no longer able to help out, it took several other people to take up the jobs that she could no longer do. Gladys remembered her as the kindest and most thoughtful woman she had ever met. When I asked for information about Deacon Hackett, I was flooded with a list of projects he accomplished. He was constantly looking for a way to help out the convent, the church, or anyone that needed a hand. He even brought my family a meal when my mother passed away. Deacon Hackett was a jack of all trades and had a long history of helping people. In fact, he was honored as Man of the Year in 1993 by the Action for Boston Community Development for his work providing clothing and home goods to charities in Boston. Cardinal Medeiros once called Deacon Bob the junk man for Jesus. Among the recent changes here at St. Brendan's, we have been graced with Deacon Dave Gioni, who is always ready with a joke, a smile, or a good homily. Another recent addition to our property are the hermitages that the Franciscans of the Primitive Observance have erected on the vast tract of land that is St. Brendan Church, and their prayers and presence have become a part of our parish life. Among Father Mullen's other accomplishments, we now have our own well water, a new organ, Stations of the Cross, a paved back parking lot, and a rosary walk. One of my favorite improvements of late is that the bell has been repaired. For the first time in many years, a bell is ringing to call everyone to Mass. God willing, our bell is just now ringing in the next 125 years of parish life here at St. Brendan's.